three, but there's no doubt that the majority of people in Scotland are less racist than they were before. They're more internationalist, more outgoing, right?
That's a very bold statement, Councillor, would you not say?
It's important to say this, though. You have to caveat it this way. The social attitude surveys show you that, but the majority also are slightly more Islamophobic than they were 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But the minority that's racist is more vocally racist. And I think what's happening to us is that minority is making its presence felt because it's been allowed to make its presence felt by the political events that have happened, particularly the obsession with immigration and asylum detention and the negative stuff around that. And obviously a large amount of our community, the African community, comes from a refugee background, right? So there's the demonizing of them. Then there's the demonizing of Muslims, so half of the African community is Muslim. So of course we're affected by Islamophobia. So inevitably we're seen as, and then that's after we've already been stereotyped for hundreds of years as violent resistors of colonial oppression and therefore threats to white man's women and liberty. They see our physical bodies as a threat to them, which is why they police us in the way they've done. Now, historically, I have to say, the stats bear this out, that while we have racism with police experiences in here, and I've pretty much most of the people I've known who are from the BME community who have a motor car have been stopped by police more than they should have been, right? Stopped by British transport police at train stations much more than should have been. Stopped by them at airports much more than they should have been. So that's a factor, but we don't have the degree of death that happens at police custody that they have in England. That's a blessing, but it's not a grounds for complacency, because the thoughts that officers are thinking with, which is what the Sheku Bayud case shows us, is that we're quite capable of one, racist homicide, two, having a system of oppression in terms of the way that the police and the courts and the justice system fails to deal with it.
Yeah. We've
got institutionalized racism. And the difference, I suppose, for here is that Scots like to think of themselves as immune to these things. From both the unionist and nationalist perspectives. The unionists will say, look, we're the great people who led the abolitionist movement. And aren't we wonderful because we abolished slavery and we abolished that sort of thing in the empire. Well, one, you had an empire. Two, that you practiced slavery for 250 years and the wealth extracted from that created Edinburgh and Glasgow, and you don't acknowledge it. But three, the other side of it is this other identity which says, oh, well, we're only poor little Scotland. We were oppressed by the English and we had nothing to do with all that oppression stuff. That was English. It wasn't. Scots did it, and the Scots were overrepresented in the empire's dealings with African people, in the enslavement of us. They were overrepresented. They were overrepresented in the slavery compensations. Scotland's about 10% of the country in the UK, whereas we were 15% of the slave compensation payees. And that's the ones in Scotland. We're not counting the Scots who were in Liverpool and Bristol. 5 top slave trading firms in Liverpool were owned by Scots. One of them was William Gladstone's dad. And we've got a big statue to him. So the statue date is important, but we need to locate it within the context of an overall history of institutionalized racism, which we've unacknowledged. And it's all part of the fact that they're an unacknowledged, still an empire. So it's not a surprise that within that retained empire, that the citizens who think of themselves as citizens of it have a perception of white supremacy in their heads, which influences how they act towards us. Because I'm sure you've experienced it, but you come from an African country which has been independent for a good long time, which has its own history and culture and history from before slavery. Do any Scots people know any of that? No, of course they don't. They think of Africa. The moment they think of Africa, they think, one, it's one single country. The other thing they think about it, they think poverty, trees, I'm going to donate to water aid and stop, donate to sites. They think of us in aid terms. They don't think of us as modern consumers who live a daily life the same as they do on iPhones and social media, going shopping in malls, which is what the majority of Africans who live in cities, that's what they do as well.
Exactly.
They also have motor cars, but they don't have that perception of us. Where do they get that negative stuff from? It's because they have a history of racism and white supremacy. So that's what we're fighting. We're fighting a system that has 450 years of shaping the brains of the people in this country in this way. It's hard. Of course, it's tiring for us to have to deal with all of that in our dealings with an individual. Because if you wanted to have the time to sort that out, you can't fight every single battle when you're here in ignorance like that.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
exactly.
you'll be exhausted.